What is going on, everybody? This is yours truly, Ronald Eddings from SecDevOps and Nano Dano from Dev Dungeon.
Hey
Today is gonna,
everybody.
today is gonna be an awesome episode. We are gonna be breaking down a Drupal vulnerability that was released last week. I believe it was on Thursday, and this vulnerability is pretty interesting because it allows an attacker to remotely launch code on a vulnerable Drupal server. And there's very little that actually that takes for this vulnerability to be exploited. And it turns out that all we have to do is find a Drupal server that has the JSON API enabled. And this isn't too uncommon. There are many services that are connected via APIs, talking to one another and sending JSON objects back and forth. Well, originally Drupal thought that patch and post were the only two HTTP verbs that were vulnerable to this type of attack, but it turns out we can also perform this attack using a GET request. So that makes this vulnerability even a bit more scary. So if you haven't updated your Drupal server to the latest version, 8.6.10 or higher, would highly recommend that you take the time out and do that. For anyone that is using a vulnerability management solution, there's also a CVE number associated with this specific vulnerability. And it has a lot of details about the description and how it works. But really, the most interesting part is when we jump into GitHub and browse to the Drupal repository and really understand what's going on here. So I'll let you take this, Nano Dano, and jump into the code.
Sure. So if you go to the Drupal project, that's github.com/Drupal/Drupal, you can look through the commits and they have them tagged by the different versions. And so this was the commit that pushed for 8.6.10. So I believe this has more than just the security fix in it. Maybe a couple other things. As you can see, it's got 51 change files, 625 additions, 156 deletions. But if you look through it, you'll see a lot of the stuff is related to serialization. And that's really where the vulnerability lives. So what happens is, normally with an authenticated request, they process the request and they do everything. If someone tries to make a request when they're not logged in, the proper thing to do is just reject the request and say, I'm not going to process it. But what happens is it will still process it and then do the authorization and reject it. But, actually it's not rejecting it is the whole problem. But the serialization is where the flaw is. And so that's basically when you take a whole bunch of data, like let's say you have a JSON object, and you want, or just a regular object, you want to serialize it down into flat text so that you can save it or pass it over the network. That's basically what it's doing. And so we're going to end up putting some dirty data into the serialized data, and it's going to unserialize it and run it. So if you look around, if you just search for serialization or serialize, you'll see that a lot of the files change regarding that. And as we flip through it, you'll see, in particular, I'm looking for a few where they actually set, I think they're more near the top, and I probably passed them already. So yeah, like right here, read-only operations are always allowed, and so they got a little more strict where before it wasn't checking so much. They're doing a little more stricter checking, but like the person pointed out in the second update, the advisory was only about post and patch, and the Git was still vulnerable.
And even the risk score was updated too.
Oh yeah. What did they push it up to? 21 to 21 of 25. Yeah, so there's another link to this PSA, which is a Drupal thing. Notice of increased risk and additional exploit path.
And also, one thing to point out, in that pull request on GitHub, there was tons of authors behind all of these commits. So it must have taken a lot of work to patch this vulnerability.
Yeah, if you look down at the bottom, if we go back to the original one, it tells you, reported by Samuel Mortensen of the Drupal security team. and fixed by all of these people.
Wow.
So these people were all involved in some form, and most of them, I say about half of them, looks like they're from the Drupal security team, and it looks like it was found by the Drupal security team. So that's kind of a good thing, that at least they're doing some good work and finding things.
Yep. Exactly. So what was that other link that you found that had some information about the RCE already?
This one?
Yeah.
So yeah, this one, as we were doing some looking around, this is the one, I believe this is the person who wrote the post, or this company. They're the ones that wrote the post that got the update, this update here that gave the new risk score. Because if you read their post, they talk about how they analyze the advisory, and it talks about how, the indication that patch or post request must be enabled is wrong. The RCE is triggerable through a GET request without any kind of authentication.
Yikes.
And so they really brought this to attention, and then they kind of demonstrated the expected behavior and how it actually behaves.
Yeah, it looks like they also pointed out some of the files that were vulnerable. Well, maybe not vulnerable, but the files that were causing the vulnerability. So if you scroll down to the file item, it's a little further. That one, and also the field item normalizer, check for serialized strings. All of those were bad pieces of code that were basically not parsing out data the correct way and turning it into an object.
Yeah, and so they were able to find all this out by doing a diff between the two versions, which is essentially what we have here on the GitHub, is a diff between the two versions. And so, the normalizer, serialized column normalizer trait, check for serialized strings, and eventually the unserialized one.
Yep.
And so, what they describe here is how the this is a normal one. You post authenticated and it says okay, thank you. But the unexpected behavior is when you try to post when you're unauthenticated, but the return message you end up getting is something like this, where it tells you unprocessable entity and it says invalid value. You give it a bad node name and it says does not correspond, which is the big clue. That's the clue that says, oh, I'm not authenticated, but it tried to parse my request because it's giving me an error saying my request wasn't formatted properly. So that's when you try and exploit the deserialization. And so that's when they talk about triggering the unserialize. And what they use there is this guzzle tool. Do you know much about guzzle? Have you ever used it before?
I haven't, but based off of like some just Google searches that I did, it sounds like Guzzle is the framework that they're using for serialization. So it sounds like they can leverage, the Ambionic security. They wrote a tool called PHP GGC that can basically take care of serializing some data for you in a very awkward fashion, to force Drupal to try to unserialize it and ultimately pass in some extra data like a command, or try to launch just something malicious, remote code execution.
Yeah, this is what I didn't realize at first, was that the Ambionics company is behind this PHP GGC.
Yep.
So that's the tool that they use to provide the serialized data. And so you run it and you can get different types of serialized data. You can get data serialized in different formats for different frameworks. So we worked through this and we were able to basically recreate the whole vulnerability and the same problems that they had. And so to demonstrate it, we're going to install a fresh one real quick and work through it. So I already have a copy of Drupal 8.6 downloaded right here. So I'm going to copy that. Well, what I'm going to do is extract it. And I'm going to rename it to test Drupal, and I'm going to put it in my home folder. So this is a freshly extracted version of Drupal 8.6.9. And you can download specific versions. Sometimes those can be tricky to find, so I'll show you real quick. If you go to Drupal and you go to downloads, try Drupal, download, and then there should be it looks a little big now. There should be a link for download specific versions.
What about if you... Okay, so it looks like you might be able to just specify it in that string, that link that was there on the last page. It said latest. Maybe you can just pass in a specific version number. If you hover over download Drupal zip again.
Yeah,
there's a latest zip. Maybe you can just copy that URL and pass in 8.6.9, for instance.
copy link. Yeah, so let's see. No, I don't want to mess with that because it ends up redirecting it somewhere. Now,
okay.
Where is it? I swear this was really easy to find the other day. But, well, let's just say Drupal download, specifically 8.6.9.
And there it is.
There we go. I just wanted to make sure. Okay, so if you need the link, it's drupal.org/project/Drupal/releases/8.6.9. And you can get it there.
Great.
So now we've got a copy here. Now to install Drupal, really all you need to do is go in and start the server. So we have a folder here called test Drupal, and you don't have to set up Apache and everything. You can just do php-s, and they have a built-in server. So we can run it like this. We'll run it on localhost port 8000, and then we'll go ahead and open the link. And it'll default to an install page because there's nothing there. There's no database. There's no settings file. So we're just going to do a standard install. And I did create the database, or I did create the permissions. It's just test Drupal. So.
Yep. And when I was testing it, what I ultimately did was I just used a Postgres Docker container just right out of the box, just to get set up without having to install SQL or anything locally.
That's definitely an option, especially if you're already familiar with Docker and have it all installed. That's probably a quicker option. So we'll just call this one test Drupal 8.6.9, and we'll give it an email address, and we'll go ahead and give NanoDano as the admin for this one.
Super secret password.
Okay, so now we're in, and we've got Drupal going, but the one thing we need to do is go to extend, and go down to the bottom, and we need to turn on the REST web services. So we need the REST and the serialization and all of that. So I'm just going to turn on all these web services here.
Yep. And these are the modules or services that make JSON calls possible, right?
Yeah, and if you don't have these on, I just canceled the server, so let's get it going again. If you turn those off, you shouldn't be vulnerable. And that's pretty much all there is to that. You either upgrade or turn those off if you have no other option. Okay, so now that it's on, we can demonstrate how to use the REST API for like a normal call that you would want to do. So I have an example here of an API request of just creating a node. So down at the bottom, there's the curl option. And what I'm doing in this Python script is I'm doing the request in Python, and I'm also outputting the curl command just to show that you can do it via curl like this or with Python. So I'll kind of walk through this. It looks like there's a lot of stuff going on, but it's actually relatively simple. So we'll start kind of in the middle. If you look down at line 23 here, and I'll make it even bigger, and close this. Okay, so on line 23 is where the request is done, and that's really where everything happens. It's just that one post request, and everything above it is just data that's getting passed into the post request. So we've got query parameters, we've got data that's being encoded, we've got our basic HTTP authorization, and some headers. And so headers are pretty straightforward. We're just telling it that it accepts JSON and that we're sending it JSON, HAL JSON in particular, and then the query format, and then the data the data is really what the API is going to process.
Yeah, it looks like it's an API call to just create a new article in the form of like a Drupal article.
Right, so the endpoint that it's going to hit is /entity/node, which is like the general endpoint for doing node stuff. And then this is kind of like an XPath being passed in to it. If you're familiar with those, it's kind of like telling the endpoint what details it wants to do and what it wants to operate on. So yeah, the data we're passing it is the type. Article is the default type of node. And then some test body and a test title. And then it's just printing out the response in the text and then printing out the curl command. So up at the top, all we really need to fill out is our authorization. This is the HTTP basic auth, and this matches the user that we just created when installing Drupal. And then the host. Those are really the only two things that you need to customize to run this, which will just basically create a node.
Let's give it a run.
Okay, so I'm using Python 3 for this one. So if I run create node, it should work. Okay. And so if you look at the output here, I'm going to scroll up a little bit. So at the top we see 201, meaning it was a successful request. That's printing out the status code. And at the very top we can see it says node 1. And this is actually indicating that it created node 1. And there's actually an NID value buried in here somewhere too. And at the bottom we see the curl command. And this is a curl command filled out with all of the variables. And I'm going to scroll down to the bottom of the code now. It's filled out with all the variables like our host and I guess that needs to be fixed a little bit to be a variable. But the curl command will work just as good. And to even demonstrate it, I'll just go ahead and paste it. And we'll see that we got another positive request back, and it says node 2. Cool. So both of those methods work, and that's normal authenticated request. And so what we want to do is
try to change your username and just show the fact that just run the curl command. You should get it unauthorized this time, right?
Sure. I'll put in a bad password, and I'll run it again.
Python 3.
I got to use Python 3, and so now it says you're not authorized, which is what we expect.
Yep.
So there's a second script here, and I named it does not correspond, and it demonstrates the problem that they were showing, how it'll still process even without authentication. So in this one, it's basically exactly what we looked at before with a couple slight modifications, namely that there's no authorization. And if you look down here on 22 where I'm doing the requests, the whole auth part is commented out just to emphasize that we are not providing any auth. And it's actually doing a get instead of a post. And right here we're referencing a node type that doesn't exist at all. That way we're triggering the error message that says, hey, you're trying to access an invalid node.
When really it should just say unauthorized, right?
Right. We should just get you're not authorized, and it shouldn't do anything. It shouldn't bother trying to process the request at all, ideally. And so this one is does not correspond. And yeah, so now you can see we got a 422 error, but in the message back we didn't get you're not authorized. We got sorry, this node type does not correspond to an entity on this site. So it actually did a database lookup and tried to see if that node type exists. Okay.
So we're looking like we're in good shape so far, according to the post.
Yeah, so from there, they explained how you trigger the serialization. And that's where the PHP GGC comes into play. And that's where you get the real, the payload that you're going to drop into it. And so here they say, yeah, having all these elements in mind, triggering and unserialized is fairly easy. Since Drupal 8 uses Guzzle, we can generate a payload using PHP GGC, which will generate the serialized string. And one clue that it's serialized is when you start seeing stuff that looks like this, where it's got brace, S, colon, and then a number, followed by a string. That's basically saying, hey, I've got a string that is this long, of this many characters, and then the string itself. And that's a fairly common format for serializing things, so you'll see that a lot. You'll see it in WordPress and stuff too. So that's one big clue you're dealing with serialized data. So to get the command, you can use PHP GGC, and so there's a GitHub repo for it.
By the same creators, Ambionics.
Right. And so all you do to use it is you do a git clone. So you would grab it, and I'm just going to do this in temp directory because I already have a copy. So you would just do git clone. Oops. Git clone, and then the address. And then you just move into the directory, and it's just a simple PHP script.
Let's just go back to the one you already have on disk, I suppose.
Yeah. Okay. So once you download it, this is what the repo looks like, and it comes with the PHP GGC executable, which is just some PHP code. So you can just /PHP GGC. It's already got the +X flag, and it gives you some help information. And then you basically have all the different options for generating different types of payloads. And so, for example, you can do. What did we do? Do we still have the command up?
It should be.
Yeah. Here's how they did it.
There we go.
So you give it the type, and in this case, it's guzzle/RCE1, and then you give it tell it system, and then the command you want. So in this case, the command that they're actually running is the ID, which is going to print out the username, and they're getting it in JSON format. So to do something equivalent, we would do PHP GGC. It's guzzle-RCE1. And then we can say system, and you can do ID, or you can do something like who am I to get a response of who you are, and tech on JSON. And then what you get is your output, and so that's how you get a copy of the serialized output. And you can put whatever command you want in there. So We've already done this, and got it into the code here, into another one called exploit. So this one is pretty much exactly like the previous one, except it's hitting a different endpoint, and we're passing in the serialized data here. And some props to this one script here, Gorks, who did something quite nice with the serialized data, and they added in some placeholders and a little method at the end to do a replace on the size and the command, so that you can dynamically pop in whatever command you want without having to run the guzzle generate every time.
Yeah, we found out that the guzzle generator wasn't quite convenient. We ran into some issues. This was a lot more reliable to land the exploit.
Yeah, so I'm gonna Alt Z so I do some word wrap so we can see some of these long lines. But basically up at the top we have a variable called remote command to execute, and you can put whatever command in there you want. And so maybe just to start we could do the who am I. But I guess
let's comment that out, and let's start with the who am I.
Yeah, so you can see that if you do a command that prints out a response, then you can see where the response happens. And then we're going to show you how to do it with a shell and get a reverse shell. So again, the command, the Python code is pretty much the same. We got the host information, the URL, the same kind of headers, a query just saying what format we're using, and then in the data that we're passing, this is where it's slightly different. And so you see the links is going to a different, it's not an XPath formally, but it's telling you
the equivalent in JSON.
Yeah.
In Drupal, yeah.
Okay, so then we do the request at the bottom, and that's it. And for this sake, we can do a print response status code and print the text too, just so we can see the response. And so we got the endpoint set. And actually, one thing that you have to do here is this node actually does have to exist. That's one thing that we found. So we'll go with node 1. And we'll go ahead and run it. And I think I'm going to have to make sure the server's running. Okay, server is still running.
The node is there. Great.
Yeah, I'm going to pull this up so you can kind of see the message pop up. Okay, so it got the request, and what we got back was a request. We got a 200 okay, but at the very bottom, at the very end of the request, after all of the body, you see that it printed out my username, and that's the who am I. That's the output of the who am I. So let's try two commands. What if we did a semicolon and an ID and we tried to rerun it? Well, in that case, it actually didn't return what we wanted, and partially there's caching going on. So we found too, like if you try and rerun it on the same one, then what you end up getting is a cache response and your exploit doesn't work. So sometimes you have to create a new node. And so in this case, we just created a new one, and this should create, that one should have created node 3 for us. And we can validate which one it was by, oh, I didn't do it in there. I did it in the other terminal, didn't I? Oh, no.
Nope.
What did I do? Oh, I put in the bad password.
Oh, right.
So let me go fix that. Let me put in a good password.
Good catch.
Okay, so if we run it now, we'll see that it successfully ran, and if we look up at the top, we see node/3. So node/3 is our freshly created node, and then if we go back into our exploit, we can do node 3, and we'll try it again and see. I haven't tried it with two commands like this where you just separate them with a semicolon, so we'll see if it works.
I think we'll be in good shape.
All right.
Nice.
Yeah, it looks like it did, and so we can see the output at the end here. We get our username, and we get the output of the ID command. So it's definitely executing shell commands, and you can definitely execute more than one without authentication. And just to show you and prove it, if you go look at the request, there's no authentication being passed in there at all.
I think the beauty of this really comes down to the fact, like we've seen single packet exploits. This is a single HTTP request exploit. It may be two if you want to find the node or find the article that you're attempting to throw this at, but really just one HTTP call to make this all work.
Yep, and if there's a site that has a lot of nodes, then you've got a lot of nodes to enumerate through and get past the caching issue. So, okay, now we want to demonstrate with the shell, right?
Yes.
Get a reverse shell. So
there's nothing better than a reverse shell.
So
shell.
I'm doing this all locally, so I'm just going to run a netcat and say netcat listen verbose on 9999. And then over here, so because I'm running Z shell, that's my preferred shell, and I'm running the Drupal server from within Z shell, and I'm calling it from Z shell, and I'm listening in Z shell and all that. So that's why we're using a Z shell reverse shell. You could use a Python one, or a Perl one, or a number of other ones. And in fact, if you go to Pen Test Monkeys, one-line reverse shells, Pen Test Monkeys has a really good cheat sheet that has reverse shells for several different languages. Highly recommend.
Yes, great resource.
Okay, so we're listening on netcat, our server's running, and our command is set. And we basically, it's saying Z shell run a command, Z mod load, and so it's loading the TCP and Z TCP, then it's making basically a TCP connection, and it's piping Z shell through it. So it's piping a shell through the TCP connection.
Exactly.
Good old reverse bind shell. So now, did we just create a new one? I guess we'll find out. Let's just try and run exploit.
Python 3.
Oh, right. Okay, no route. Okay, so parameter was not converted, so I think that's what happens when you have a node that doesn't exist. So right. let me run create again. Okay, and then we'll confirm that this shows node 4. Node 4 was created. And then our exploit up here is using node 4. Node 4. So now if we run the exploit command again, over here on the left, we should see a shell pop up in this window. And we do.
Bam.
And so over here, the PHP server looks like it served a request just like normal. And it should, if we pull it up in the browser, it should still serve. No, it's getting hung up. Yeah, it's getting hung up because we have the shell open. So right now you can see we've got a shell. We can do ls, print working directory, who am I, ID. I can even make a directory.
So this is a great time to maybe work our way around this. Maybe we could do an ampersand at the end of the command to ultimately put it to the background.
Good. And see, as soon as I exited out that shell,
Yeah.
it continued serving requests. So that's a good point. What if, and where would we put it though? Just like tack 1 on at the very end here?
I believe so. I think that'll be good enough for it.
Yeah, so and the and is saying only run that if the previous command worked, right? So it's saying do this, and if that works, then do this one. And if that works, then run this one. And then, yeah, at the end, we're say background that one. Background that one instead of staying open. So, yeah, let's try that.
Yep.
Okay, so we're going to have to create one. And then let's roll up our number here and run exploit again after getting our netcat listener going. And
Good thinking.
Server's still going? Yeah, server's still going. Okay, and we haven't had to restart the server at all through any of this yet. Okay, bam. Now we've got another connection, and we can confirm that it's up. So let's try pulling it up in the browser. Oh, good call.
Perfect.
That worked.
Yes.
So now the shell went into the background, and the server continues to operate as normal. And if we go to content, you can see all the nodes that we created in the testing. Now, we didn't create the nodes through an exploit, but we're getting the shell through the exploit. And so
Exactly.
that's it. That's how you get a shell in Drupal 8.9. And so if you want, we can try and copy in the 8.10 core and just see if it works still.
We could give it a shot.
Okay, yeah, so I've got Drupal 8.6.10 downloaded already. And so let me turn off the server. And to upgrade the core, all you really have to do is copy in all the files. So let's go into, what was it called, test Drupal?
Yep,
Okay,
test
so
Drupal.
just copy and drag all of them here. And we're going to say replace all.
And that's really what Drupal's doing when you upgrade. What was the command to upgrade?
Drush. Drush is the command line tool. Uh-oh. Hopefully that was just one of them. Okay, so now if we can try and check the version if we restart it.
Great.
Okay, so it's still working. Reports. There should be one called check for updates. Status report.
Yep.
Yeah, Drupal version 8.6.10. Okay, so it's updated. Now we can go ahead and try the exploit again. So we'll try and create a node, and that still works. As expected, it should, because that's actually the authenticated request. So it created node 6. So now let's try the exploit on node 6. And just to confirm, let's pull up the modules and make sure that those REST modules are still turned on, and they are.
And start your listener. Let's see what happens.
Okay, Netcat's listening. PHP server's running. We updated the number in the code, so let's go ahead and run it and see if we get a shell. And we don't. We get this website encountered an unexpected error, and over here we actually get a red 500 server error, and it says uncaught PHP exception. The generic field item normalizer cannot denormalize string values for options, properties of link, blah blah blah. So it seems to now be blocking the attack that we were just doing.
Yeah, and as an attacker, just knowing that we're creating unnecessary log lines by throwing an old exploit at a newer version, that could definitely pose a risk if we're already inside of a network and trying to pivot around. So it's wise to really understand the target before just going and throwing random exploits. Perfect. This has been awesome. Looks like from start to finish, we looked at a CVE, got information about it, found public information, and the code's all necessary and it's open. So very straightforward stuff.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought this one up to me. I do have a lot of background in Drupal. I spent a few years as a Drupal developer, but I've been out of the loop for a long time. But it's interesting to see these vulnerabilities pop up. So when you brought this one to me to start investigating, I thought it was really interesting.
Yeah, I'm really glad we finally got together and made at least one happen, and especially one as interesting as this. Where can so this is all on your GitHub. We have links everywhere to all of the resources we just showed. So I think that we have it all covered here.
Yep, I did push those 3 scripts along with the links to the references that we used. And so those examples are here up on my dev dungeon. And Ronald, you're free to put a copy up on yours too.
Yeah, I'll fork it and I'll put it in the show notes also on mine.
So I think that covers it. Is there anything else you wanted to cover while we're here?
No, I think that is it for this one. There's definitely going to be many more of these. Hopefully we can just get together and really walk the dog on these interesting vulnerabilities.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody.
Yes, thanks. Leave your comments and feedback below. Nano Dano, it's been a pleasure. Can't wait to the next one.
Likewise. Have a good night.
You too.